and welcome to another episode of Purple Ponderings with Pankaj. Today we have with us John Jackovin from Tech Ventures on our show. And this is an episode that I'm very excited about because we've not had someone, with an accelerator, someone who works with an accelerator and has had an interesting startup background on the show. So without further ado, John, if you want to take a few minutes, introduce yourself, a little bit about your background to our viewers, and then also one thing which a lot of people may not know about.
Oh, all right. One thing that people don't know about me. So yeah, let's start with definitely most people don't know about my background. So I'll start there, and then hopefully curate something in my brain about what people don't know about me. So, Punkage, thanks for having me on the podcast. My name is John Jackovin. I am the executive director for the Tech Ventures Accelerator. I do not come from the insurance world. I come from the startup technology world. When I was 24, without any technology background, by the way, somebody came to me with an idea and asked if I could build it. I naively said, yes, I can absolutely do that. So I bought a book, taught myself how to program. Now, this is many, many, many years ago, so it was in Visual Basic. But created a product, sold our first customer. Within a year, we had $1 million in $1 million plus in revenue. So at that point, I thought building companies was just simple. And over the last 20 years, I've learned that it is not simple and easy. It's actually really difficult. Took a company through Techstars in Boulder, Colorado in 2014, and yeah, became the executive director for the BTV Accelerator in January of 2020, right before the pandemic hit. So all the thoughts and ideas that we had about what the program was going to be got thrown out the window, and we had to adjust. Something that people don't know about me. So I got this a bunch of times when I was at ITC. Is that everybody came up to me and said, "You're a lot bigger in real life than you are on a Zoom call." And that's not the thing that you don't know about me. But when I was a kid, so I played soccer my entire life. I don't look like a soccer player. That's my point. But even played up until I think I was like 20. I played, I made a soccer team called the Des Moines Menace. It's a semi-pro soccer team in Des Moines, Iowa, where I'm located. Made the first Des Moines Menace soccer team. Then realized I needed to stop. So at that point, but yeah, so big time soccer player growing up. Never played football. So there's another there's another interesting thing about me.
Yeah, that's really interesting as well, and I can vouch for the fact that you're indeed larger than what you appear to be on screen. But I think that's how your personality is as well, right? Virtual or in reality. You said something about building businesses, like learning how businesses are built from scratch, and you've seen a lot of different kind of startups. Like you've been an operator yourself, you've been on the other side as an investor, as worked with Techstars, and so you've had the opportunity to see so many of the startups sort of come up. What do you think is the? If I were to just ask you, because I think a lot of the startups make a lot of mistakes, but what would you say would be the number one mistake that a lot of the startups make, which is common?
Yeah, so I'll go. I think at every stage, it represents an opportunity to make another big mistake. So let's start where kind of early on. Early on, probably the biggest mistake is building something that people don't absolutely need. Like it's very tempting to fall in love with a solution as opposed to falling in love with the problem. And so oftentimes you'll find somebody, they identify a problem that is a legit problem, and then they go, I know how to fix this. And they go and they build it in the dark with very little like communication. And ultimately what happens is they build something that nobody actually wants because it doesn't actually solve the problem. Whereas if you're just focused on the problem more, you can get a lot more traction and feedback and that sort of thing. So building stuff that doesn't actually hit the mark. That's probably number one for earlier stage companies.
That's great advice. And by the way, I do another set of podcast videos, and my second last video that I released was about my own mistake, which was exactly that. That I jumped in and I started building something because as a first-time founder, you that's just a natural instinct, right? You don't know any better. Startups are about building and doing something, and unless you create something, you don't feel like you're working. So it's a very counterintuitive kind of a mistake, which I completely agree with you is one that people make. Just staying on the topic of startups and insurtechs, right now that you're not from the insurance industry, but you are now in the pits of it, right? With the broker tech ventures play, working with brokers and carriers and insurers and Insurtech. So, there is a lot of I call it there is a hype versus reality kind of a question related to funding, right? You see all these funding numbers that fintech, especially Insurtech, is buzzing, but the numbers and the just if you look at them might lead you to certain conclusions. But someone like you would have done some analysis as you've seen this ecosystem move along as the funding activities increase. Where do you think is what's how would you just sort of from your perspective look at what's the hype part of this versus the reality part of it?
Yeah, so I think there's a bit of hype around people thinking that any idea, that has some sort of cogent thought process behind it can get funded, and that's not the case. I mean, the VCs and investors and angel investors are still looking for the same thing that they did, that they have always done. The reality though is that the ones that are getting funded at a lot higher valuation. So you're starting to see. I mean, to give some perspective, and granted now this goes over the course of 20 years, but to give perspective, back in the day, seed rounds were a couple 100,000 to 500,000. Series A's were 1 to 2 million, and B's maybe got up to five. You're starting to see some seed rounds that are in the 5, 10, 15, and $20 million valuations. My concern is that because there's a lot of money out there, instead of diversifying and funding more projects, what's happening is that we're giving just more money to the people who are going to get money anyway. And that's somewhat concerning because it creates more of a divide between those that can, because they have a $20 million seed fund and can run for years, versus those who have to bootstrap. And the divide just continues to grow. And so I can't tell you that that's actually happening, but that's my concern when you start seeing these mega seed funds that have come out recently, that it's not providing more access to capital, it's just providing the same people access to more capital. Bit nuanced, but big difference.
Yeah, I totally agree with your analysis because to me, it was very easy to see how the funding amounts have increased exponentially, but the number of deals have decreased so much. So you're absolutely right. The funding per transaction has gone up. As a first-time founder, I just have a whole lot of learning that I've had on how the ecosystem rewards the serial founder, the serial entrepreneur all the time versus sort of, for the first time founder, there's a lot more ground to cover. And so that's kind of a passionate topic for me. So let me ask you something about, because this podcast is focused on, even though we look at IoT a little bit more closely, and I'll ask you a perspective on it. The broader theme is sort of emerging technologies, right? So we've always had technologies emerge from time to time, and some of them take off in the context of sort of the enterprises, depending upon the problem that they solve. It takes some time, especially in insurance. Technology adoption has always been lagging behind. But in the last few years, we've seen everything from AI, ML, blockchain, IoT, augmented reality, etc. So to kind of hit the word, but when it comes to insurance, again, it's kind of like slower to come in. So just from your perspective, I wanted to see if there is any nuggets of wisdom on these technologies to become more mainstream within insurance, right? So how do you kind of analyze that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the reality is that the less risk an industry as a whole tends to take on, the slower adoption will be for any technologies. And a lot of the times I think that risk is predicated on how comfortable somebody feels, potentially losing revenue in some capacity. So, if you look at IoT, or you look at virtual reality, or something that maybe an end consumer would use, let's say, now theoretically they could get it from the carrier, they could get it from the broker, but ultimately somebody is going to have to introduce that technology. And an introduction to a technology that doesn't work, or doesn't work as promised, or looks bad on the introducer. So a lot of it has to do with just the level of risk that anybody's willing to, individually or collectively shell out. And insurance historically has been a lower risk industry, right? That is exactly what insurance tries to protect itself from, is exposing, to risk. So I think the you see select individuals and instances and organizations that tend to be open to failure, and I think that's ultimately where insurance will get, is it's okay to fail on projects and companies and implementations, but as long as you try and you learn, that itself, that learning is valuable. And so there's nuggets and value that you can take from that, and then you can then proceed down a new path. And so it's just taken insurance a little bit longer. But the reality too is that while insurance may be slower, or historically have been slower, a lot of industries are slow. Regulated industries typically are way slower, but still, just your standard, somebody who makes a table saw or something like that, they're still slow to implement technologies, because it's opportunity cost. It's money and time that you're not putting elsewhere. And so sometimes it's easier and better to bet on proven return on investment, right? Like, just strictly numbers. Hey, if I can get a 3%, 5% ROI on this, great. But I take a lot of risk if I want to go after the thing that has, 50% or 60%, whatever it is. So it's a mentality, and I think slowly insurance is figuring it out. And if they don't, then you get companies that come in and disrupt an industry, very much like Netflix did to Blockbuster, and Amazon has done to the entire retail chain. It's sometimes it just happens.
Got it, got it, got it. So, so in that context, if I were to ask you to look at, let's say, the smart sensors, the IoT, right, which is one of the technologies that we certainly have, work on. But from your perspective, what do you see as what's your perspective on that technology's adoption in the insurance industry?
Yeah, so I mean, it's going to be different. It's going to be different on personal versus commercial, right? Personal, it's Notion or Vivint or Ring, or somebody with little sensors that they can kind of build and add, and that sort of thing. And certainly, insurance companies are going to offer discounts, and on homeowners insurance, if you have, you know, all these detectors that can monitor your home and your possessions, and that sort of thing. On commercial insurance, the phrase that I've always used, I heard it probably 20 years ago, and I was like, oh, that's a really good. I'm going to use that, and I have ever since. Is it's a juice versus squeeze, right, equation? Is the juice worth the squeeze? And so it's what, and this isn't specific to necessarily IoT, but it could be virtual reality, it could be whatever, is am I going to get out of it enough to warrant the cost, the investment, the scale up, the learning, the whatever it might be on the front end. And I think I definitely think, I mean, the value is there. It's just, how do you get people to care enough about that value, right? Like, if it meant for a building owner that it was going to save them, I don't know, $1,000 a month, is $1,000 enough to get somebody to move, right? Like, or is it going to save them from one catastrophic event that happens once in 15 years? I don't know. Maybe is the like so it's really this weird balancing act of, hey, this could save you money, or this could save your business, or this could save, and then they go, yeah, but what's the likelihood that that's going to happen? Right? Like, that's the reason why people like don't buy flood insurance. They live in floodplains, because they're like, oh, it's a 500-year flood. Well, in Iowa, where I am, the 500-year flood happens every like 4 or 5 years now. So it becomes the thing where people are like, with monitoring and preventing catastrophic events in their head. They're like, well, how often is that? How often am I going to get burglarized? How often is there going to be a flood? How often, is there going to be a fire? It doesn't prevent us from putting in fire alarms, because you got to, right? Like, it's mandatory, right? You can't build a building without a fire system, a house without fire alarms. So it's just a very interesting time where the technology is there and it works, but do people feel that there is enough of an incentive to do it? And once there is, then people will absolutely do it.
Got it. Got it. So, my next question was going to be, what's the one thing that you think needs to be solved, or one thing uh, that needs to happen for it to become mainstream? I think you explained it in your previous answer really well about the juice and the squeeze. And by the way, I love that phrase. I think it just gets it, like the expense increase and the loss
Right.
ratio reduction. The common man, juice and squeeze. People,
I,
everybody can
I, I
relate to that.
picture I picture myself standing over a cup with like two halves of an orange, just shaking and squeezing, and you get a half an inch of juice at the bottom, and you're like, well, that wasn't worth it.
Exactly, exactly. And I think some of the initial problems with the industry, with any of these technologies, is also quantifying the juice and the squeeze, and having a validated third party data that says, yes, that indeed is the juice and that indeed is the squeeze. Because depending on who you are, you can always like have, the vendor
Oh,
or
yeah.
your stakeholder just say that, hey, I think it's there, but like who else, are you able to, is it a perception? Is that the reality kind of thing? So I
The,
see where,
yeah, I
where
was
you're
gonna
going with
say
that.
that somebody said to me, and I don't know who it was, and I don't know when in my career it was, but they said, you know, if I saved as much as every software vendor told me I would save, I would have no expenses at this point. Like, because everybody's like, oh, this will save you this much, and this will. So obviously, it's not the case. So it's, how do you truly, to your point, have some sort of external validation that goes, hey, you're gonna invest this, but in 3 months or 6 months or 12 months or whatever it is, you're gonna recoup those, right? Versus, yes, it's tough to quantify the juice and the squeeze a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But having said that, I will say that sometimes when something is so new that you can't wait 5 or 10 years of data to come up, you've got to sort of model out, like it's like from a startup investment standpoint, right? You model out what are you expecting to see over a period of time, and see if you're hitting those metrics or not. And if you don't hit it, shut it down. If you do, then keep going, right? So I think there are ways to think around them. But to your earlier point, I think what I see as the biggest challenge in the insurance industry is because the industry is so risk averse that all the leaders, the business setup, the checks and balances are so tied to not taking any risk, right? So therefore, can you really convince an organization that's already set in its ways to measure performance of its people and leaders to say, hey, I'll measure you on how you lose $1 million at the end of the year, right? You have to do it beautifully. So, like, there is no good answer to that, and nobody's ready to sign up for that kind of, sort of a hypothetical situation. But anyway, so we'll keep going now. This is very fascinating. As you can see, you're really hitting a lot of topics which are hard for me. Switching on a little bit and understanding the person John is, I'll ask you a little bit more about your sort of. This is to sort of get people to know you, the personality behind John. So let me start by asking you, what is your proudest achievement and your biggest learning till date?
Proudest achievement. Yeah, that's so probably the one that, I mean, selling a company is always fun. That's pretty cool. Honestly, probably my biggest accomplishment was teaching myself how to code, and this goes back, you know, 20 some odd years. I had never programmed anything in my life. I actually learned how to program by troubleshooting when I was at first job before I started my entrepreneurial journey. There was this custom developed product that we were doing internally at the company I was working for, and it kept breaking. And so I was like, could you just give me access to the source code, and maybe I can like see where it's breaking? And yeah, and so I actually just jumped into the source code a little bit and started teaching myself. And so that's probably my biggest accomplishment when it comes to just I always like learning new things. So I have a kind of a creative bend to me, and building on the web is kind of fun because it you get to create something without having to you know cut lumber and build something like in the physical world. It's pretty cool. Probably the biggest learning that I had, it's probably tied. So in 20 let's see, it was 2009, end of 2009, we started competing. The technology company that I had started back at the turn of the century. We started competing with a company that we were partners with at one point because they started competing with us. They're actually a not for profit organization, and they basically didn't like the fact that we were going to compete with them, regardless of whether they were going to compete with us. And we had meetings with their CEOs and stuff like that, and they were like, "Yeah, no, we don't see a place for you in this," and so they were very blunt that they didn't want us in the game anymore. And so we started to compete against them. Totally from a legal perspective, we have multiple lawyers like look at everything, and they're like, you can do this, go ahead and run with it. So we did, and within 2 weeks they had a temporary restraining order on our company telling us that we couldn't communicate with any of our customers. I mean, it was this big whole blow up thing. It was in the state of Delaware because that's where our agreements had originally been located. And within 2 weeks, we basically had to shut the company down. So we were on pace to double revenue. We were probably about 4 million. We were about ready to do 8 million the next year. And 2 weeks, the company was gone. It, I learned very quickly that like criminal justice and business, business law, personal law, very different. You're not guaranteed representation. You're not guaranteed a day in court. It's all about money. It's all about who has enough money to outspend one another. So it was a big loss. Obviously, you can imagine having a company that you've been running for years, and then all of a sudden just kind of like disappears. And so I learned a lot about myself personally. Also learned a lot about going up against competition with more money. Is if they're litigious, they can they can do some major damage and potentially even run you out of business in its entirety.
So that sounds like a very interesting, event which, led you to some insightful learnings that it looks like you've carried with you since then. So let me ask you this for the benefit of those startups who are always resource constrained, right? So
Yep.
if they ever find themselves in this kind of a situation where they're doing something which some big brother doesn't like what would you advise at a very high level? What are some couple of
Yeah. So, first and foremost, try to anticipate what are the bad things that could happen with any agreement that you get into. Run through different scenarios. This is one where at the time I signed it, and it was being, it said, oh, if there's any litigation, it'll occur in the state of Delaware. And that's commonplace, right? Because Delaware is a state where people incorporate because it has friendly laws and regulations, and so you sign it and you're like, oh, okay, that's not a big deal. Well, it turned out to be a really big deal because our lawyer couldn't litigate in Delaware, so you have to find a lawyer that can litigate in Delaware, and Delaware lawyers have a captive. They can charge whatever they want because it's Delaware. Like, you got to have representation, and so I would say just be careful with the agreements that you sign, and really, really look through them and be like, all right, what's the worst that could happen with this particular agreement? Some are pretty innocuous, but other ones could be painful under the right circumstances. So read your documentation, read your legal agreements really, really well, and make sure you know all of the components of what happens if everything goes bad.
Got it. Got it. Well, those are a couple of really good advice. And that response actually is a good segue to my next question, which is along with this learning, I'm sure you kept yourself up to date with what's happening in the world so that you're constantly learning and looking at do's and don'ts. So just wanted to ask you, how do you keep yourself up to date? Is there someone that you follow, read?
Yeah, it's a combined effort. Twitter is really good for at least in my experience, for data aggregation or list aggregation or content aggregation. That is a great place. So you just follow the right people, and you can get news and information that flows through there. Also, I talk to a lot of startups. I talk to a lot of startups. So I start kind of developing my own, mental modeling of trends and things that are happening. When you hear about a really innovative startup and you talk to them and you're like, oh, that's really cool. And then the next week you talk to somebody and you're like, that is also kind of along the same vein. Like, you start seeing these patterns that occur. So yeah, I mean, a lot of it's there's some newsletters out there that are pretty good. PitchBook is a good newsletter for kind of like bigger trends. But yeah, a lot of it has to do with the startups that we talk to, and then part of the cool part of BTV is that there's, I might get the number wrong now, 28 or so partners at this point, and they send me interesting startups and interesting news and that sort of thing. So they act as a bit of my eyes and ears when it comes to maybe more local startups and trends and things that are happening. So yeah, it's a combination of a lot of different resources.
So let's say in a future episode of Purple Pondings, if I were to ask you, who would you like to, see as a guest on the show? What name or names come to your mind?
Let's see. So I'm talking to a particular startup. They're called Ascend, ASCEND, and they're tackling a space that I have a bit of background in. So prior to BTV, I worked in the fintech space, right? In basically a company that created an API to move money, right, between banks, so ACH. And this Ascend has raised a ton of money for where they're at, and they're tackling the space of payments within insurance. And I guess I kind of already assumed that had been figured out, but I guess not. I guess, like, because payments, whether it's pay-ins or payouts, have different, like, flows. And so, I had assumed that was all kind of figured out, and that's why I hadn't seen any, startups around there. But apparently, Ascend is doing something within payments. So that would be one that jumps out, which could be interesting.
Got it. Got it. So you mean to have someone from the Ascent team be on the be on the podcast, is what you're saying.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'm gonna have a conversation with them, but I would be really interested in kind of the backstory on why there hasn't been a technology solution to automate or route payments or, provide a ledger for like whatever it is. I still don't know exactly what they do, but
Okay, got it, got it.
yeah, it would be interesting to go through what the what it looks like today, right? Because like obviously people are getting paid, companies are getting paid, so what problem are they solving? Is it a paper check to is it just a routing of funds? I don't know, just kind of an interesting space given my more recent background.
Got it, got it. Well, with that, we come to the last section of this, interview, which is I'm going to give you a series of two choices, and then you have to pick one of the two choices and also tell us why you selected that choice.
Okay.
Okay. So start with baseball or football.
Let's go with football. Well, so I'm a big college football fan, less on the pros, but mostly because the I'm a Bears fan, and it's been pretty bad being a
Yeah,
Bears fan, right?
I'm with you
So
on that. Yeah.
yeah, so even last night, we almost won, right? We're within inches of winning, and we didn't. So it's been tough, but I'm a big Iowa Hawkeyes fan, and I would have to, I guess, if I had to pick one, I'd pick football over baseball. But I'm a big Cubs fan, and I was really, 2016 was wonderful, and this year was the dismantling of the Cubs was really really bad, late summer. So yeah, so football.
Got it. Superman or Spider-Man?
I'm gonna have to go with Superman only because people tell me that I look like Superman sometimes. So yeah, definitely
Yeah.
Superman.
Yep. Absolutely. I can see that resemblance. Well, hopefully, one day we can see you. I'm sure one of your favorite Halloween costumes then would be the Superman with a cape, huh?
I'll tell you what, the easiest costume is dress up in a suit and put a like Superman t-shirt underneath the suit. Yeah, I mean it's
Yeah.
super easy.
Super easy. All right. Golf or tennis?
I've never played golf, so I used to play tennis when I was younger. So let's go tennis.
Paper books or ebooks?
I find that paper is more engaging. It's easy for like me, my brain starts going off into distant like thoughts very, very easily. So for me, paper is more engaging, more tactile. So I'll go paper.
Texas Hold'em or blackjack?
Let's go blackjack only because I understand it. I understand the game better than I do Texas Hold'em.
Got it. Got it. When it comes to movies and films, Scarlett Johansson or Anne Hathaway?
Oh, Scarlett Johansson.
And why?
I don't know. I like her work. How's that?
Super. That was a curveball, but you handled it really well.
Yeah.
Iron Man or Captain America?
That's a tough one. I'm a big Marvel's Universe fan. Let's go Captain America.
All
And
right.
why? I don't know. He's just wholesome.
Got it. Well, you also look closer to Captain America than Iron Man. How's that?
There we go.
And finally, if you were to take a vacation, and I know all of us need one, would you prefer Hawaii or Iceland?
Did you say Iceland?
Yeah.
Yeah. I am the type of person who enjoys going on vacation and doing absolutely nothing. So I'm gonna say laying on a beach in Hawaii sounds perfect.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, on that note, we come to an end of this podcast. Any final words from you, John, before we wrap up?
Well, if we're talking to startups, my final words would be just keep trying. Like I've seen so many startups that have been around for such a long time, and something changes and something clicks, and I realize that you can't live for forever, and it's important to put a zombie startup out of its misery. But if you're finding traction as you pivot and as you change, keep going because sometimes it's just it's a matter of weeks or months before you actually hit something. And yeah, so keep the faith. I know it's hard sometimes, but if there's anything we can do to help or I can do to help, feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Sounds good. Sounds good. So, on that note, we come to an end to this episode of Purple Ponderings. We'll be back very soon with another guest. Till then, goodbye.